It's time for The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour with us. Celestine, Bohlen, columnist for the International New York Times. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome as well to Hamdam Mostafavi, editor-in-chief of courrierinternational.com, which gives you the best of the world's press each week.
And online every day.
Yes.
Yes.
And also with us, Paul Taylor, Europe editor for the Reuters news agency, and Emre Demir of the Turkish daily newspaper Zaman and of Zaman.fr. Thank you very much for being with us. The World This Week, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag TWTW. Let the games begin. Okay, so Sochi was better known as a summer resort, but no matter. Vladimir Putin literally moving mountains to bring the Winter Games to the Black Sea. His moment of glory is now upon us.
We understand it was not an easy decision to make, to grant the right to host the Games in a city which back then barely had 10 to 15% of the infrastructure required. But you placed your faith in our potential. You placed your faith in the Russian character, which doesn't flinch from difficulties, and that unites us.
Celestine, Bohlen, what have you learned about the Russian character this week?
Well, I mean, I think it, in the end, they did it. And I mean, that was kind of predictable. I mean, forget the hotel rooms, forget the stray dogs. And I was just reading that the sportsmen, I mean, the athletes are pretty happy with their housing. The journalists are the ones that came up short. And I think that, frankly, Putin doesn't really like journalists. So there's something kind of fitting for that. But, I think it's, the big venues are going to be probably fine. This is a very Soviet-type operation. The Soviets did it before. The Russians can do it now. I mean, there's a kind of, bulldoze ahead at whatever cost or whatever manpower needed. And this was extremely costly.
Paul Taylor, you're a sports fan. Do you feel a bit of schizophrenia? Because on the one hand, we've had this big political story with Vladimir Putin, all the debate about the so-called anti-gay propaganda laws, the way that migrant workers were exploited in the building of these venues. But at the same time, we've got some ice skating and some alpine skiing on the way.
Well, these things are always sort of an attempt to sort of showcase the nation. And actually what always comes out, I think, in the way the Olympics take place is something you actually, countries really show themselves as they actually are. And I think what we're seeing here is exactly that. Russia is showing itself as it is, which is capable of grand designs, capable of extravagance, capable of wasting huge amounts of public money, and putting it into the pockets of private people who may or may not be connected to the organizers of the games, capable of maltreating some people and treating others just fine and dandy. And sport, well, the Russians love sport and have always, as in the Soviet era, made sport a sort of element of national pride. I would just contrast it with the rather extraordinary Olympic Games in London a couple of years ago, where you had this opening ceremony that was kind of funny, modest, referenced things like pop culture, the National Health Service, children's fables, and so on. And it was totally different in atmosphere. And everybody thought that London, which is a sort of crowded, inefficient city, would fall flat on its face and make a complete dog's breakfast of organizing an Olympics. And to our own astonishment, the British people, I think, we somehow managed it. Well, the Russians are managing it too, but in a very Russian way.
But the one thing I was relieved to see that we didn't have Putin jumping out of a helicopter like the Queen.
Yeah.
I mean, a simulated
right.
jump.
Yes, no.
But
James Bond was also not involved in it.
That would be pretty horrific kind of scene.
Emre Demir, Turkey's just been passed over for Olympics. Looking at the opening ceremonies today, what are your thoughts? Do you wish you had them?
Well, at the end, they did it, but it was supposed to show the new Russia, the powerful Russia of Putin, and yet we saw and we will see, I think, a PR disaster for Russia, and it will show all the failures of the Putin administration. And if it was for Turkey, it would be the same. These kind of organizations.
Really, you think it's going to be a PR disaster? These
it is already. For example, if we talk about the extreme security measures, it is necessary. It is legitimate. It is understandable, but it shows us the weak face of Russia, the security problems, the terror problem, and it always shows the failures of the Putin's Russia too.
All right, doubting Thomases have not held back. It's true when it comes to public relations in the build-up to the game. Celestine was mentioning the journalists complaining about their accommodations. Take Wednesday's cover of the New York Daily News, which offered detailed reporting on crappy toilets and foul waters at what it called a $51 billion five-ring circus. A senior official told a reporter from the Wall Street Journal that authorities had surveillance videos from hotels showing people leave the shower on. Well, that kind of backfired. It only made the problem worse with headlines like this one, that there are spies in the toilets. Do you think, Hamdam Mostafavi, do you think that the Western media coverage has been unfair, maybe?
It might be a little unfair, I think. We rejoice in those things to see that the Russians didn't do everything well. But I wonder really if it's really PR for us, the Western medias, or is it for the Russians themselves, just to show to the rest of the country, it's Putin's games. He can show he's the leader of the nation, he's a sportsman himself, and now he's showing that to the rest of the country. I'm not really sure it's really for us to see, but really for the Russian to understand that he's the leader, and now the Russia is a united country, and forget the Pussy Riots, forget Khodorkovsky, forget all the rest of the people.
I've heard it said, Celestine Bohlen, that there's been a lot of infrastructure that's been updated in this in this region in the south,
right,
and that the long-term effects of the games could be quite beneficial in that respect.
I mean, I think to be fair, I think that developing this resort, which is really kind of Russia's only spot in the sun, I mean, really, when you get down to it, it's on the Black Sea, and it was an old resort, but pretty second rate, and now it's all going to be spruced up. The train station is the second biggest in all of Russia, and that's saying something. Fancy tunnels going up to these ski resorts, which will remain and be good. I think the bad news for Sochi, which is that there's a glut of housing, a glut of hotels, and a dearth of people to take care of not only those hotels and that housing, but the roads and the train tracks and the train station and everything else. And actually, I think, and it's not the only city, but I think Sochi is going to find itself footing the bill even after $50 billion has been spent. And that's the thing that's, I think, unfair, because Sochi could use a boost, and in a way it's gotten it, but it came at a price tag. So
this sort of long-term Olympic bonus is something that tends to be vastly exaggerated. Think only of Athens, which had spent a fortune on Olympic infrastructure and had a huge financial crisis only a couple of years later. And basically, the Olympic infrastructure in Athens lies largely abandoned, deserted. Not to mention, of course, places like Sarajevo that have had it in the past.
All right, we talked about spying in the shower. Speaking of spying, who leaked a phone conversation between the Assistant Secretary of State and the U.S. Ambassador to Kiev? Victoria Nuland has already apologized for some strong language.
So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. When I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
All right. The strong language, by the way, dates back to last November. January. Why is it coming out now? January. Excuse me. January.
A couple of weeks old.
No one's saying who done it. We are, though, getting some frank diplomacy out of Washington on this.
We think this is a new low in Russian tradecraft in terms of publicizing, posting I don't have any other independent details about the origin of the YouTube video. You're right. This is clearly happened overnight and is relatively new. But this is something they've been actively promoting, posting on, tweeting about, and certainly that we feel that represents a new low.
Well, she's blaming Russia.
Well, I mean, I have to say that, you know, it takes some expert listeners to go through hours of tapes to find the 1 4-minute segment where the American says, buzz off, or, well, I mean, it's not exact, to hell with the EU, basically.
Careful.
I know. It's 4 letters, too. But the thing is, so, I mean, you know, whether who's got their fingerprints on it, I mean, either way, it's pretty, you know, it's a pretty bad show, but so was hers.
Well, if it was the Russians, then all one can say is that it ill befits the United States to complain about other countries listening in and recording their diplomats. Perhaps the Russians went a little further if it was indeed they who put it online.
That's the point. And it's interesting that Angela Merkel, who's been very vocal critic of the U.S. spying, scandal, has been saying that it's totally unacceptable.
Yeah. No, the language is unacceptable.
The language is what
but
she said.
But she hasn't really said much about the leaking, as far as I know. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, you mean if she'd said flip the EU, that would have been all right?
That's right.
I think, you know, there are genuine differences here as to what you do about Ukraine. And the Americans think that it's time to get tough and to push pieces around the chessboard, and the Europeans have reservations, partly because they live next door to Ukraine, about whether that's a smart idea or not.
Well, the parliament has voted to go with sanctions against people involved in the violence. So, you know, I mean, to some extent, I think since January 25th, when that tape was made, the U.S. and the EU have actually kind of come into sync, and I think that's
come into sync. And the Ukrainians did not heed the advice that the U.S. wanted to give them in that phone conversation. Our correspondent in Kiev was telling us a short while ago, Hamdam Mostafavi, that well, the 4-letter epithet aimed at the European Union went down well with protesters in Kiev. Some of them have even put him on billboards.
Yeah, I think they're a bit disappointed with the EU themselves. And now they're looking for more actions and less like diplomatic chattering all around. It's been, I don't know, like 2-3 months now almost, and nothing significant has been done. So I think it's time for the EU really to show what they want to do this time.
Emre, Demir, what should the European Union be doing?
Well, the leaked conversation shows us the declining soft power of European Union in Ukraine. First of all, if you look at what EU did since Ukraine's candidature, we saw that they didn't give enough incentive for Ukraine to follow up the negotiations. They didn't financially aid to Ukraine. They didn't give immediate financial help to Ukraine. So this kind of errors of this kind of moves of the European Union first, and EU became a less important actor in Ukraine.
Yeah, they kind of pretend they don't want to play the same game as Russia, like giving money to
Russia, which is dangling that promise of a 15 billion euro bailout.
Yeah, on one side they're trying to show they're not playing this game, but they are doing it anyway because they were discussing giving them money. So it's really a bit strange position, I think.
How would you explain to the European taxpayer making large payments to Ukraine at this time with a government which is way down at the bottom of Transparency International's, corruption perceptions ratings, with, massive allegations of corruption, and a country that has refused to negotiate a loan from the International Monetary Fund because it doesn't want to accept the conditions which would require it to raise gas prices at home and things like that. So it's very hard, I think, for any a country that doesn't have lots of cash hanging around to say we should give lots of aid to Ukraine now. And I don't blame the Europeans. I think it would be politically very hard to justify within Europe.
Also, I mean, I'm not sure it's, does necessarily works. I mean, throwing more money at a corrupt government doesn't necessarily get you a clean government. So, I think that's one thing. The other thing is, I do think that at the beginning they didn't explain, they didn't counter the Russian arguments, and that would have been an effective use of soft power or diplomatic power, whatever you want to. I think at this point, to me, the interesting thing is what is appropriate in terms of trying to bang some heads together to get these people, get the Ukrainians to come up with a constitutional reform. It sounds pretty crass when you hear it on a telephone call. We want this guy and we don't want that guy, and we don't want to think that that's what goes on. But are we surprised, that that is what goes on? The other thing, finally, is I think it's a mistake to disregard Russia's interests in this case. I mean, the fact is that they have big interests. They care.
I was going to say, what about the timeline of all this? Because President Yanukovych is meeting President Putin today obviously in Sochi, on the sidelines of the opening ceremonies of the Games. We've got the Olympics on. The world's eye is on Russia. Right. How does Russia react in Ukraine once the Olympic flame has gone out?
Well, there are various things, and in fact, I just wrote something about this. I think, you could do the gas war, you could do the trade war, you could do some military muscle pumping on the border. You can play covert games. Of those four, two are probably already underway. There's a kind of a trade war. It's hard to measure how real it is, but it's reported. And
there were some remarks this week out of Moscow saying they're behind on payment when it comes to gas.
Some people say that it's unlikely that Gazprom, which is in a rather weaker position than it was in 2009 when they did it last time, they don't want to do this again a third time. They've got European customers who are, desperately looking for other places to buy their gas. So I think, that's why I sort of feel that, funnily enough, maybe instead of treating this like a zero-sum game, which Putin does, I don't see why the West has to go in for that. I don't think it's, our win, their loss. Russia will be there. It's not going anywhere. It's a rather big place. It's got a long border, long history, a lot of very, sensitive subjects in Ukraine. So, if we could just, it's unfortunate, this conversation, but if we could only, kind of ratchet it down, maybe the Olympic spirit will inspire somebody.
The Olympic spirit. The Olympic spirit definitely present in Sochi. I don't know if it's present in Kiev. Certainly not from what our correspondent was telling us. Stay with us. Much more to come here on France 24 in the world this week in our second half.